In this video, I'm going to show you the basics of rendering in Maya. Maya comes with several render engines that you can work with whenever you are beginning your projects and finalizing at the very end once you have everything in place. For this demonstration, I'm just going to use the sphere that I scaled up in the perspective view. And what we are going to be looking at first is we are actually going to come up to your modeling bar where you have several of your boards here talking about rendering. These are located right next to what is called your hypershade window. And the one I'd really like you to draw your attention to is this display render settings. It looks like a little board that has the little cog on it. If you click on that, this is going to open up and bring up the entire render settings options available to you, specific to the renderer. Now by default, yours should say something like render layer, master layer. You'll want to leave that as is, but your render using might look a little different. I'd like to draw your attention to this first and click on the drop down here. And what you will actually see in here is you will see several different renderers. For the start of the course here, we will be sticking to the Maya software as it can render out a lot more. However, it does lose a little detail. The Arnold renderer was an additional renderer that was purchased by Autodesk that does allow for much more realistic looking type of models. So make sure before you actually begin rendering out something that you are set to the Maya software. And what you will see is then you will have two tabs here, one specific for just common options, but also one specific to the Maya software renderer. The common is what you're going to want to look at here. First, you're going to want to look at your Maya file output here. Now, I normally just leave this as far as the scene name is concerned, but one thing I do change is under image format here. If you notice here, you have a lot of different options, and some things I'd like to draw your attention to is yes, you can do the GIF in the JPEG, but in the PNG, I'd also like to point out though, notice you can make Photoshop documents. So that's something that you can also utilize as far as going between Photoshop and Maya in the future if you'd like to. I'm going to set this to PNG, and then just scrolling down here, the other things to get started as far as rendering is the image size itself here. A 960 by 540 document is absolutely fine. You could take up the size if you wanted it to be a little larger, let's say for a portfolio. For submissions though, this will be fine. So what I'm going to do here is also check my resolution, but really outside of that, at this point in the class here, until we get more in depth into the other renderers, this is fine to get you started for actually getting a published version of your renders. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out here. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate back up here and I'm going to render the current frame. So I'm going to click on that. Maya will think for a second and you're going to get this pop-up window that is showing pretty much exactly what we have here in the perspective view. Now a couple of things to point out. If you'd like to change the view or the size, you actually do that in your view here. So if I wanted to zoom in and make the sphere a little larger, so I'm using that middle mouse wheel to zoom in. And then I can come back up here and I can just render the current frame and you see how it actually reflects the frame render for me. Now once I've done that, let's say this is how I want my render. You have a couple of options. I'm going to come up and do File, and we're going to save the image. This will give us a published version of our document. So notice now by default, because of the settings we set for the Maya software, it defaults to the PNG published file type. So I'm going to call this my render. Another thing you want to make sure of here is that you are set to the color managed item for right now. With us not working with materials and textures yet, this isn't too big of a deal. The save mode will become more important as we begin adding in materials and textures. And I'm going to go ahead here, I'm going to save my file. And now if I go ahead and minimize out here, you can now see the PNG is popping up for my render. So you can now see the sphere there. And now you have a published version of your Maya model that you could now use on things such as your portfolio or if you wanted to post it onto social media.